It's essentially a relaunching of the Ukrainian Reform Monitor, which I hope you either have a copy or you've seen an electronic copy. This is an annual assessment, and we thought that the best way to celebrate not just the relaunch of the monitor, but also to talk about or to celebrate the Ukrainian reforms is actually talk about it honestly. So we tried to put together a panel where both the government as well as civil society representatives as well and the European Action Service are here. I think what Ukraine needs is, since I always explaining Ukraine as it's one of the reasons why it's more interesting, because it's a lot of information warfare internally. Not only the Russian hybrid propaganda, but also the internal information warfare. And therefore, there is a lot of various pieces of information which kind of needs to be checked. So we try to do that with a team of contributors. Anastasiya Leukhina is with us. She's covering the national security. Next to him is going to be Valerii Pekar, who is the head of Nova Kraina, or the new country. Now, Valerii is not part of the contributors team of the monitors. We invited him because he's one of these few and new civil society representatives who are not funded by the West or by the European Union, but essentially homegrown, entrepreneurship and entrepreneur-based. Next to him is Dmytro Shymkiv, who is the deputy head of the presidential administration in Ukraine, and also the head of the National Reform Council. I think it's still valid. Secretary, sorry. Yes, the president is the head. Yes. Thank you. That's an important correction. And he is kind of also playing a role of Mr. Reform, I would say, from Ukraine, in the West as well as at home, which I think is an important combination. And he obviously going to give us the point of view from the Ukrainian government. And last but not least, Dirk Schuebel, who is the head of the division of the Eastern Partnership, the European External Action Service. I know Dirk for about 15 or 16 years, and importantly, we met in Kiev. So he is one of those European diplomats who really knows these countries and the Eastern Partnership inside and out. And I hope he can go beyond, even despite we are on the record, he can go beyond the usual talking points of the European Commission. So, without further ado, I would like to, we're going to start with Mr. Shymkiv, followed by Valerii Pekar, then Anastasiya Leukhina, and then Dirk Schuebel is going to be the last one. I would like to ask 5-6 minutes. We'll try to be strict, and also would like to leave a discussion, a room for discussion, as well as for your questions later on. Mr. Shymkiv.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for being here. I've been here a year ago with a story about what's been done by Ukraine in the multiple fronts. I had more time last time to talk about the reforms. The list is pretty extensive, so I'll try to stick to the 5 minutes. First of all, I want to congratulate everyone here, because as you are present here, you're really interested in Ukraine and the things that develop in Ukraine. And yesterday, the events yesterday, the decision of the Coreper on the visa-free regime with Ukraine is a very important milestone. A lot of people look at this milestone as just free traveling, the key element of the traveling in the principles of Europe, but there is 144 actions that should have been completed by Ukrainian government. And these actions actually had a split into 4 blocks. And these blocks are very important elements because many of them is about institutions. It's about anti-corruption. It's about introducing a lot of legislative about equal rights, etc. All these small pieces are also part of the reforms. Visa liberalization, it was the goal, but the path to this goal was the key enabler for many reforms. Transparency of law enforcement agency, anti-corruption principles, etc., etc. It's a big, big list. So when we look at this, the set of the reforms that took place in Ukraine, the list is comprehensive. Ukraine launched the reforms 3 years ago on the broad fronts. We started with starting from the macro financial stabilization. If you look how the government of Ukraine started its operation, it was 10,000 euros to manage the country of more than 40 million people. It has a very, inflation rate in the 2015 was 45%. and the reserves were in very bad shape. We had a situation, we had aggression from Russia, we had on all fronts, from economic, military, trade, information warfare, all kind of things you can imagine the gray zone of the fights of contemporary warfare we experience in Ukraine. And at the same time, we had to address the internal conflicts or the internal challenges, anti-corruption practices, inefficient government institution, the funding, vested interests, etc. So how this was being addressed? The primary focus of the reform agenda was about institution building. So institution capacity, probably this is the highlight of the change. Military, institution change. An institution based on the principle of NATO and the governance that exists in the NATO. And that's presented in the strategic bulletin. When we look at the anti-corruption institution, independence of NABU, the capacity of training people and growing their ability to bring cases to the courts and defend cases in the courts. E-declaration is another institution which is about transparency of public officials. When we're talking about energy reform, zero gas from Russia, and the increase of tariffs to the citizen, removing the gaps that have been used for corrupted practices. When we look at the banking sector, another corruption gaps being closed with the removal of more than 80 banks, which been used as an instrument to raise capital to finance private ideas of the owners of the banks. So yes, many people would be, if I would be collecting votes of these people, now, would they be willing to make changes in the banking system? I doubt that people will be voting for this. The same with the tariffs. I don't think there will be a lot of encouragement for this. But this is important institutional changes without which the system of non-transparency would continue to live and exist in Ukraine. And I know there is a lot of opposition and a lot of concern, but this is the decisive steps that had been done by the Ukrainian government. Now, another example of Naftogaz, probably the interesting example, it was $8 billion deficit. Now it's a profitable company with independent board of directors and a lot of elements of the actually making money for the state. State-owned enterprises, we appointed people who has international background and surprise, surprise. Well, we probably paid them as well. And surprise, surprise, they we start receiving profits from this company. So going into the areas of decentralization, it's another, but it's also a question about empowering communities and giving more power to the communities. We give them more, not just we double the quantity of the communities, but we also give them 50% more money. We created a fund to which they applied, and they can run projects. And again, it's about empowerment and learning and leadership within the regions. So I know that my 5 minutes already gone, and I still have a big list what I wanted to say. So I'll try to communicate this through the different things. And the case like Prozoro, this is another example of closing gaps. The idea of Ukrainian reforms are based on the principles of EU. And I know that a lot of people might say, well, the discussion about membership is highly political. We're discussing the qualification. When we designed the concept of Ukrainian reform, it was based on the qualification criteria for membership. It's very clear. Association agenda is structured around 35 criteria. And every line in association agenda is actually a project to be implemented. And that's why when people ask me why there is so many things to be done in the reforms, that's because it's a big list. That was the foundation. And then when we're talking about anti-corruption, is again, my highlight is removing gaps. Would there be resistance? Of course. And when we talk about slow, I mean, the title of the meeting is a slow thing. Well, I'll give you a story which I discovered. In February, there was a story published by one of respected Ukrainian NGOs about that there was 2 weeks with no reforms. So that was a kind of a complaint, so I decided to look what actually happened in these 2 weeks. It was the last week of January and the first week of February. That's exactly the period when Avdiivka took place. And I can tell you that the President, Minister of Regional Development, Minister of Energy, Minister of Defense, and all Cabinet and Prime Minister were working on emergency. They could have worked on decentralization. They could have worked on the energy laws. but they spent 2 weeks fixing the problem of the security. It's a fact. It's something that security situation steals time and energy. It's not an excuse, it's a fact. And I think that support of EU and international members to help us to address the security situation is something that will enable us to actually accelerate reforms big time. Internal struggles? We do have internal struggles. It wouldn't be a politics, it wouldn't be a democratic society if we wouldn't have discussions, struggles, and etc. But through the struggles and engagement of civil society and members of the parliament and diversity of political forces, we've actually been able to reach the consensus in the areas where sometimes it's difficult to reach consensus. So, yeah, I completely overrun. I'll probably stop now and let answer the questions through the conversation later.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I would like to move to Valerii. And the question is, this is a long list of success stories, right? And what is the opinion of the average Vladimir on the street on these?
Okay, why Vladimir? I don't know. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, and thank you, Carnegie Europe, for inviting. If we shall ask an average citizen on the street what about the progress of reforms in 2016, I'm not sure that this average citizen is Vladimir, by the way. But anyway, he or she will say that nothing changed, and this is definitely not true. So we should speak about two things: what is definitely being held, and why people think that this is not, that nothing changed. But I would like to be a little bit more concrete after a helicopter view of Dmytro, and say about top achievements and top disappointments of 2016. Indeed, two major top achievements of 2016 were electronic declarations and gas market reform. Electronic declarations, you know about that, and with all open registries and all openness of assets, as some people joke, Ukraine indeed is now not only the most corrupt country in Europe, but also the most transparent country in Europe. And you are indeed, we are sure that both features could not exist simultaneously too long. Either corruption or transparency should go down and others should go up. And indeed here again we would like to thank for Western pressure and Western support, because it was vital, because without that it was not impossible to gain. And gas market reform was another very important point of 2016, not only because we finally broke the dependence of Russian gas. Recently we celebrated 500 days without Russian gas. But also the very important thing is that all major fortunes of Ukrainian oligarchs were made on gas trade. No other business or corruption or political activity could provide people with such a huge fortunes like gas trade, and that means that there will be no new oligarchs in Ukraine anymore, never, because in the past, when some oligarchs went down, some oligarchs went up, using the same gas trade scheme, which were transferred from one hand to another. No more oligarchs in Ukraine, because it never be possible to do this without black schemes on gas trade. So these are two major achievements on 2016. There are others which are not too small, but indeed a little bit smaller, not so important. I would like to mention them. First, a selection of new judges to the Supreme Court of Ukraine were relaunched. The Supreme Court will be totally rebooted. Then successful local elections in new municipalities will prove that decentralization is going on. Decentralization is extremely important. I wouldn't like to repeat what Dmytro said. Many important steps in economic freedom were done, including abolition of price regulation, which was absolutely the communist legacy, and simplification of sort of services important for our Ukrainian IT, and even small improvements in tax legislation. Then Prozoro platform for transparent online procurement was made last year mandatory, not also for state purchasers, but for all public purchasers, including local authorities and so on. Then finally, a reform of education was unblocked, and maybe even more important, reform of public health finally was unblocked. And we had, last but not least, early and transparent and due start of the budget process. Unfortunately, the end of budget process was business as usual, not too surprising, but too sad. But the start was very inspiring. That means that we can. So I would like to mention many smaller things to create a vision that everything is really going on, which is true, but being limited in time, I would like to pay attention to major disappointments of last year, and I am sorry to repeatedly use the word again. Failure of privatization again. Privatization again was postponed. Land market opening was again postponed. Comprehensive tax reform was again postponed. Institutional reform of fiscal service was again postponed. Budget reform was started, as I have said, but again it was postponed, and some other minor things, but this is all about economic freedom and corruption, which means that in terms of economic freedom, we really are much lower than we need. I think I will tell a little bit more when we shall speak about priorities for next, let's say, year in reforms, and ask for international support for these focused reforms. But also I would like to say that one of the major disappointments indeed of 2016 is that many famous successful reformers left their offices being exhausted both emotionally and financially, and sometimes feeling like that they could not do anymore. And this dramatically decrease the capacity of reformist forces. This is all about institutions. I am sure that we shall speak about institutions today a little bit more. But this is not only to political will. Usually journalists used to say that there is an absence of a lack of political will, which is true, but this is just a part of the truth. Another part of the truth is a lack of implementation capacity, which we should speak a little bit more later, and indeed a very important thing always in shadow, a lack of demand. Lack of demand for reforms in Ukraine is a very important social feature. Maybe I will pass here the floor to Anastasiya, which will tell more, including personal experience in this field.
Thank you. Indeed, let's now move to Anastasiya, and indeed the lack of demand, which Anastasiya, we have been having a little tour into Berlin and Brussels with meetings, and I really thought that you should explain here as well, everywhere else, like what is exactly this lack of demand and what is causing, what are the criteria of this lack of demand currently? Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to start with the thesis that reform is a two-way street. On the one hand, you have the government who has to deliver, initiate and implement reform, but on the other hand, you have the society who has to want it and to put pressure to get it. So it's the supply side, the government, and the population as the demand side. And I think we can criticize the supply side and the government and Mr. Reform for not having enough reform or for having it too slow, but we should also criticize ourselves for not putting enough pressure on the government to make it happen. And I think we have seen from the reform that has been successful, the public procurement, the National Bank, Ministry of Finance, the police reforms, yes, I mean, they have been successful to a more or less extent in a different way, but all of them were successful because there was a lot of public pressure and because civil society organized itself. And on those fronts that we didn't organize ourselves, we as a state have not been so successful. So I think we talk a lot about the fight against corruption, but we should really talk about creating demand for a different level of accountability and a different quality of governance. So I'd like to briefly share a couple of trends in terms of civil society development. Among the positive ones, we see that there are more people who volunteer their time and more people who donate to charities. So these are positive trends of civil society development. On the other hand, we also have some negative trends. And among them, only 1/3 of people are ready to refuse giving a bribe. I think that indicates the lack of demand for a more transparent government. 42% believe they will not report if they were demanded a bribe, and this indicates the lack of demand for a more accountable service. When people are asked who are the key pushers for reform, somehow even the West gets more points than the population itself, so people do not view themselves as a stakeholder in the process. And I think the most disturbing number, when people are asked who is responsible for reform, only 1% believe that the population itself. So I guess with that, I just want to suggest that when we look at the overall picture, when we design technical assistance and when we develop the reform agenda, we always have to look at both sides. And unless we develop the demand side, the supply side will not follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now let's move toward the European view. Dirk, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I was looking around, and when I saw the list of people who are coming, and I thought some people want to make us believe there is a fatigue of Ukraine in Europe. I think alone this meeting here proves the opposite. There's a lot of interest in Ukraine, and there's even more interest to make Ukraine work, to make a success story out of Ukraine. Before I come to the reforms, I wanted to say a few words on the main hindering element, and I think Mr. Shymkiv mentioned this already. That's, of course, the war in eastern Ukraine. And we had to now experience, unfortunately, the first killed monitor of the OSCE in the course of, or end of last week. And 2 more monitors have been injured. That adds up to the many casualties that we had already to state. More than 10,000 officially, more than 20,000 wounded. That shows where where one of the main the biggest hindering ground, of course, for a successful reform in Ukraine lies. So therefore, once again, also from our side, there is an urgent need for progress on a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The Minsk agreements are not ideal, we all know that, but they are the only basis we have, and they are the only game in town. Security situation is still extremely volatile, as we all know. Therefore, it would be indeed very good to have a true ceasefire and not only one of the many ceasefires that are not respected. A bit of a critical word on the steps taken by all sides over the last few months, starting with the decisions taken by Russia and by the separatists, which have, in a way, contributed to the further isolation of the non-government controlled areas. And we believe that this negative spiral must be reversed. We want to see an inclusive approach. That is very important for us. And obviously, Crimea, I didn't mention yet, the illegal annexation of Crimea. We see the continuous human rights violations from the Russian side. Just yesterday, I think, a Crimean Tatar activist was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Reforms. I think we have seen in the last 2 years more changes and more reforms than in the entire previous period of independence of Ukraine. Therefore, this is good. And also given these challenging security contexts that I mentioned, I think we have seen really visible results, but obviously a lot more remains to be done. The previous speakers have announced some of those issues. Adoption of constitutional amendments and the reform of the judiciary last June was a big success. Amendments related to the decentralization, on the other hand, they are still outstanding, and that would be something that we would like to see. Reforms of the law enforcement had a successful start. National police was created in 2015. The new head of the national police was emerged from a real competition, which was open and transparent. Reform of the public prosecutor's office remains urgent still at all levels. This year, a new selection for local prosecutors will take place, so we would very much like to see a proper delineation of competencies and cooperation between the prosecution and other agencies with investigative powers, which is very important. We have 3 anti-corruption agencies which have been set up: NABU, NAPC, and SAPO. The resources of these institutions have to be strengthened if they are to play a meaningful role. And we are also closely following the selection of the NABU auditors, which has been discussed very much in the media also. The first wave of the e-asset declarations has been submitted, as we all know, has received all the attention, and we see some first high-level corruption cases, Mr. Nazirov, Mr. Martinenko, which have been sent to court. We hope they will be properly followed up. Recent amendments, of course, to the e-asset declaration, which added anti-corruption civic activists to the list of persons obliged to submit such declarations, they have to be revoked for a number of reasons. First, the fight against corruption should by definition focus on public officials and not be directed against civil society. Second, the relevant provisions are very unclear and they can easily lead to legal uncertainty, to arbitrariness and also to selectiveness in their application. And also we believe that the provisions will negatively affect the assistance programs financed by international donors, including the EU, because some people might not be willing anymore, the best qualified might not be willing to work anymore for such bodies. Continuation of the reform of the judiciary and prosecution should go faster. We also hope for significant results after the creation of the new Supreme Court, you mentioned this, and the high anti-corruption court in the near future. Public administration reform is also to be mentioned. We like the high commitment from your side that you are paying to this, and we also we also like to see, of course, that the Ukrainian economy is actually on an upward slope. Many people would not have thought this, but the IMF predicts, for instance, a 2.5% real growth in GDP this year, which is, I think, a major achievement if this is materializing. On our cooperation, obviously, provisional application of the DCFTA, we believe it has produced already some good results. The volume of trade between the EU and Ukraine has increased by more than 8% in just 1 year. That is, I think, very good. The proposal by the Commission for improving access to the EU market for a number of Ukrainian products, we call that autonomous trade measures, is now currently being considered by both Parliament and the Council and hopefully will soon go through. We also look forward to see the implementation of the challenging reform plans that the government has for this year. Privatization was mentioned. That is indeed a field which we think is important. Healthcare, land reform, another topic. Electricity market law, we hope also that the reforms in the field of energy will get back to the speed that they had in the beginning. There is a bit of a stagnation now, so we hope that we'll move faster. So to sum up, we believe that Ukraine's key to success is in continuing the reforms and implementation in an irreversible manner. I think that is what is counting. There's need for an appropriate legislative framework, capacity, tackling vested interests, that is linked to corruption, of course. Sustainable economic growth and also the business climate should be further improved. And of course, last but certainly not least, eliminating corruption, which has to restore the trust in the public institution and first of all also in the judicial system. So these are a number of issues. I'm soon there, Balázs, don't worry. Inclusive approach I mentioned already at the beginning. So there's a need to avoid a division between East and West Ukraine. Very, very important, I think, to bring the sides, to keep the sides together and to be inclusive also to those which are currently, those areas where people live which are currently not under control of the central authorities. We do see a strong pro-European approach, both in the government and also in the Rada, which of course helps in a way to maintain the momentum. Now all have to speak simply with one voice, and all these vested interests that we have seen have to be overcome. I think you cannot complain about lack of support from the EU. I think it is unprecedented what the EU has been doing for Ukraine over the last few years. We have the EU advisory mission to reform the civilian security sector. We have set up the support group for Ukraine in a period of financial crisis. More than 30 new jobs have been created in the Commission just to help Ukraine. Unprecedented delegation has been reinforced, and I don't want to talk about the massive financial support. Close to 12 billion euros have been foreseen between 2014 and 2020 to reach Ukraine. Visa-free, you have already mentioned. We very much hope that in the next few days or weeks we are going to see the final result, so that soon Ukraine will follow Georgia and will have a visa-free regime with the European Union or with the Schengen states of the European Union. I think it would make a big difference, and it's a real encouragement because it would be the first thing that everybody can see in Ukraine. And of course, we hope that also the association agreement can finally be ratified by the last missing EU member state, the Netherlands, so that finally it can fully enter into force, and that will also help to gain speed in the reform process, as we are convinced. I'm happy to answer your questions if you have any in the course of the discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you. It was very dynamic and very factual, and indeed a lot of food for thought for all the speakers. And the good news is that we have almost 50 minutes for the debate, your questions. I have a few questions, but I would like to open first now for your questions collecting a few and going back to the panel. So hands up, please. Any questions? Right there, Olena? We need a microphone, perhaps, or?
Olena Pristaika, Ukrainian think tank liaison office in Brussels. So welcome the conference on Ukraine. The more Ukraine is better. And I have a question to Valerii Pekar, to your initial question to the audience. So what has been done and why it is not seen? And I refer to the Ukrainian people. I'm not saying that everybody say, but how to deal with this notion? We all recognize that a lot has been done and expert community also has done. But how do you explain why Ukrainians sometimes do not see this and how to handle this? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Christina?
Don't ask me, please.
Yes, you can.
Thank you. I would have a question to Valerii.
You can identify yourself, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'm Christina Murphy, External Election Service, working with Dirk, a desk officer. I wanted to ask Valerii to elaborate a bit on, you said that the reform of the education was unblocked. If you can say a bit more about that. And also to Anastasiya about what do you think or what could you say about the communication of the government internally towards the population, or what can be improved?
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Then I would like to add actually three more. So we have why Ukrainians don't see progress, the lack of educational reforms, and the government communication. I would like to ask also Valerii and Anastasiya about the corruption. What exactly the issue with the corruption now, how that has changed. Also, I would like to ask Dmytro about the de-oligarchization. How is that going? And number 3 is the politics of reform. What exactly we can expect in the next year or two? I mean, the European Commission is very outspoken and put a lot of its support toward privatization and economic reform. At the same time, you know, soon is going to be elections. In 2019, President Poroshenko is facing re-election. If it's not going to be early elections, I don't think so in person. So how you can explain us what to expect within the framework of politics of reforms?
Should I start?
Yes, you should start, Valerii, Anastasiya, and then Dmytro.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Olena, for a good question. Why people don't show reforms? I am proud to be a member of the team which developed in the beginning of 2015 a balanced scorecard of Ukrainian reforms to set concrete KPIs based exactly on association agreement with the European Union to show how you have progress in reforms. And if we shall take a look to this balanced scorecard, we shall see that paperwork, so preparatory work, legislation, is something in average around 60–70% done, which is not bad for 3 years. And if we shall take a look to implementation, sometimes we shall see that it is 3–4% just. Why? Because implementation could be done on local level only. Imagine education reform. A minister of education, whoever he or she could be, could not reach every small town with education reform concept and do the reform in the local school. And not a minister, but a director of a local school will decide whether there will be a reform, and if yes, which one. And also the public health reform, not a minister, but a boss of a local hospital will decide whether there will be a public health reform in this concrete town. And that here we again are coming back to a demand part, because local implementation could be done only under pressure of local civil society. Not minister, not national-wide, not Kyiv-based, let's say, civil society organization could reach every town. And unfortunately, today, Ukrainian civil society is major big city-based. Everything is fine in cities like Kyiv, Odessa, Dnipro, or some minor cities like Ivano-Frankivsk or Mariupol. More or less, take 20, 30 big cities in Ukraine, it's more or less going ahead. But in smaller towns from 10 to 40, let's say, or 50,000 people, which are hundreds of towns like that in Ukraine, never changed. Nothing changed, because their people see no changes, because they are not prepared to demand changes, they aren't prepared to push changes, they aren't prepared to contribute to changes. Everything is grabbed by local clans from positions of procurator and judge and police boss to all local business opportunities. And these small towns is absolutely different social reality from big cities where civil society really exists. So that is why many people, they are not part of change, and that is why they could not see changes. And then I would like also to cover an issue of corruption. The issue of corruption is, so what is with corruption in Ukraine, what to do? First of all, I have to say that the situation dramatically changed, and all monitors show this. Corruption on the low level is shrunk and sometimes practically eliminated. What I mean? Police bribes, payment for, so new police don't take, and if take or solicit, they are dismissed. Payment for licenses, huge amount of licenses is now cancelled. Public services, administrative services which go online, tenders which go online and transparent now through Prozoro. So at this point, at this level, where usual people know about, face corruption, it shrunk and even eliminated sometimes. But on high level, corruption is huge, and first of all, it is connected to state-owned enterprises. You know probably that Ukraine has something approximately 3,500 state-owned enterprises, which is 100 times more than average European country, and political clan simply grabs these companies and prevent independent supervisory boards, prevent independent audit, prevent transparency, prevent reporting, and at this level corruption may be even expanded, because those people who previously earned money on licenses and tenders now cannot afford to do this anymore, so they go to rule state-owned enterprises. That is why privatization is so vital, and where privatization is not in time, corporate governance reform is vital, and this is one of the focus. So, and what to do with corruption? Not only to catch some corrupted top officials, which indeed is important, because people demand justice, but really it is evident that people demand more sentences than justice. They would like to see some real top corruptioners in the jail, not only arrested and with some evidence base, but in jail according to rule of law, which is not the case for the moment. But also there is another way which is even more important in long-term run to open the system. A Nobel Prize winner in economics, Douglas North, said many times that in closed societies and closed economics, corruption is not a disease. This is a basis of everything, of everyday's life. Imagine a Ukrainian town, small or medium size, when you cannot afford to get surgery without paying money, or you cannot teach your child in a school without paying money to specific schedule funds to finance books and classrooms and so on and so on. Eliminate corruption immediately and the life will be stopped. So the case is not to, is to open the system, not to keep system closed and fight with corruption, but to open the system to eliminate corruption at all.
Thank you, Nastya.
I'd like to comment on two things: why people don't feel the reform, and also the question about the government communication on reform. I think why people don't feel the reform, there are two aspects of it. Again, supply and demand. The biggest successes that Valerii named, the Naftogaz and e-declarations, they don't really touch people's lives. So that's an objective factor. But on the other hand, in order to feel the benefit of reform, you actually have to take advantage of it. And I want to give two examples how people don't take advantage of reform. One is decentralization. Now we see really big influxes of funding into local governments and cities from the budget. And that also means the question is, how do we spend all that money that just fell off the sky to us? And basically, in order for decentralization to work, you need, again, to have a demand for a different governance from the citizens, and you need to have a different level of involvement into the decision making. And it's very rare that we see people joining and requesting a different level of decision making on how to use these funds and participating in the decisions on how these funds will be allocated. Another example is, for instance, the law on access to information. It was adopted a couple of years ago after a decade of fight, which is a major law that gives people, citizens, any citizen, a tool to get access to information and do something about the problems, but it's very rarely used. So in order to feel the reform, you actually have to actively use the benefit of it, and that's also part of the education and work with the population that also needs to be done. On the government communication side of it, I think there are three basic factors why people do not understand what reform is going on, and I would like to name them. One is basically we have very low general education level in population. I think it's the most educated, one of the most educated nations on earth. But educated means having a diploma, not necessarily a real education, and this is why people do not have the skills, the critical thinking to evaluate, and the knowledge to understand what is going on, and many of them don't bother. So this is why I think support to the education reform in the long term is critical to making this change happen, along with all the economic reforms that were already mentioned. The second thing is, I think government does not take communication seriously, and I want to give a couple of examples. I was involved directly in the police reform, and at the beginning it was really critical for us when we were establishing the patrol service to get as many applications of new people to join the new service. And I saw how the number of applications grew exponentially almost after large media events, when ECHA would come to a region and talk to the press and meet the local community, etc. Like, the impact of that communication was huge. I mean, we would literally have like a 10-fold increase in applications after each visit. So I think we don't allocate enough resources for communication, and sometimes we don't take it seriously. And the third reason is media access and access to TV. Since we don't have a lot of independent TV and very limited access to TV, and in order to get access to the hearts and minds of the majority, you must have access to TV. I think some of the government officials and also pro-reform people suffer from the lack of access to TV. For instance, the Ministry of Health are saying they basically do not have access to TV at all, which makes it very difficult to communicate health reform. And I think this is why it's crucial to support the public broadcasting initiative in all the forms, because it will increase people's access to information.
Mr. Shymkiv?
Thank you. I'll try to also touch base on the education. The challenge of Ukrainian education system, it's even though that we very often celebrate the success of being a highly educated, but it's the contemporary world of 21st century. It's a different type of education which is needed. It's a need for the soft skills. It's a need of understanding of social role, and etc. Not the programmatic remembering the materials that have been stuffed in your head. And that's a kind of a key reform agenda that's been driven by Minister of Healthcare, or Ministry of Education, who was actually former teacher in the chemistry, and then who was with a lot of creative approach. And I can tell you that right now, the education reform, I can tell you, because I can assess different reforms, have they been prepared. This is by far probably the best example, because they have plan, they have details in the plan, they have convincing story, they build coalition with parents, with deputy members of the parliament, with kids, with the international community. They also agreed on the budget with Ministry of Finance for the 3 year, kind of how they would like to see it. And so it's in terms of, and they have a detailed timeline. So it's, for me, this is secondary education, one of the most well prepared going forward. Still, there is a people who kind of nagging about it, but it's good that in terms of discussion that we had in the National Reform Council, we clarify things. So, but people still reluctant to change, and many parents are wants people to learn math to the bones and not social skills. And I think that we also need to educate our, adult education about transformation in the world. And that's why visa liberalization enables people to see how it is here. Now about the, a little bit of communication, and it's going to touch to the oligarchization and like TVs. We do not have independent TV. Ukrainian TVs are owned by oligarchs. What we did, we introduced laws which actually suit the need to disclose who own TV channels. 74% of population receive information through TV. Well, internet is growing, but it's not enough. And this is very important thing about access to TV, ability to actually tell the story, etc. As well as to broadcast alternative stories. In the world of experts, or everybody is an expert, we have a new trend in Ukraine, which is called expert. Expert at everything. And it's the same faces. In the morning, that person is an expert on security. Next, in a few minutes, he is already expert, or she is already expert on the foreign policy. And then it's energy, and then it's education, and then it's social. And I've seen such expert, and it's also the problem is not just in Ukraine, it's actually the global issue, the end of the experts in the sense of experts. And the high-fly discussion, emotional talk show for the sake of, I call it dogfights, not the show, quality discussion about content of the reform. Content of reform is boring. Whenever you start a discussion with somebody, judicial reform, structure, and etc., people get, oh, no, give us some fishy thing, the problematic stories, etc. So that's, of course, fundamental, and it's not only issue in Ukraine. It's actually, if you look at any country doing reforms, in Europe, in North America, South America, Africa, Asia, you will always find it as talking about changes is boring. Well, let's get some fishy thing. So that's about communication. It still needs to find a concept of communication. Probably the best example that is so far, it's police and this decentralization which is currently started. It's about building the common identity and going forward into the region and educating people. But it's not an easy thing when you have a breadth of the reforms. Now the oligarchization. Well, where we had oligarchs, it's easier when I can tell you we are going, etc. Let's look gas. Introduction of the gas law, transparency of Naftogaz, increasing tariffs. You can't anymore play on the high tariffs for the citizens, for the businesses, low tariffs for the citizens, claiming that the citizens consume so much gas because it is still the same pipe. Lack of metering system. That's an easy way to actually make a lot of money. And then also another thing, a lot of waste in the pipe. It was the standards being pretty high, a lot of things get wasted. That's how money been made. So what's happened? Gas law, tariffs are the same for commercial and private users. The subsidies goes to the people, not to the companies. The small limit what could be waste in the pipes. So all this regulation that had been introduced actually made the business of owning gas, pipes, and etc. It's still business, but it's not really profitable, and you have to run on a very thin margin, and etc. So as a result, gas market stopped being very attractive for oligarchs as a business ransom. Another example is banks. Banks being another structure where you set up a bank, and we have many banks. So you set up a bank, then you attract every Ukrainian citizen because of lack of education. You say 25%, 40% interest rate. So you collect money, and you finance for 2-3% your own business. That's been a classical model in Ukraine. There was no responsibility, and if the bank fails, it's the government responsibility. It's not us. So when you start shutting down these models, well there is Gontarev is an extremely bad person. You bring coffins in front of her house and do all kind of harassment to again, because that was the fundamental ransoming of the state, and also you could put people who will hate, people who would change the reforms. So banks, regulation, cleaning of the system, That's another level of de-oligarchization. TV, introduction of the transparency who owned what. None of the TV in Ukraine is profitable. They are all subsidized. All, 100%. None makes money. Even with advertising market, with everything. It's all loss-making. Electricity market, changes in the electricity law, introduction of the transparency, and the implementation of the electricity law. That's another will be big step in the de-oligarchization. SOEs, state-owned enterprises, another example. And I forgot to mention before I touched SOEs and this connected. The famous story of the Ukernafta, this is connected with the gas and oil. When we introduced, we abolished some of the legislation which allowed some minor shareholders to block things. Actually, it was with a lot of problems in the media and a lot of messages. Still, we've been finally able to receive dividends that the state-owned enterprise should have received from the enterprise. And this was another example. Yes, there was a lot of, some oligarchs get extremely upset. But they actually finally paid to the state. SOEs is a question about who governs, introducing the governance mechanism, transparency with Prozoro. You can't really funnel money anymore in a non-transparent way. Still, there is many state-owned enterprises who procure fruits and other interesting products, which has nothing to do because it's enable them to play tricks with VAT. But again, as we are currently, there is a work on the transparent VAT system and analysis, we actually can stop a lot of non-transparent way of managing VAT in the country. But this is a kind of a high-level overview on the different areas, and we're trying to identify other spots where oligarchs made money. Because oligarchy, they have two options. They can become a wealthy people in the country, still running the business, which is fine. We're not against wealthy people. We are against those who are trying to use the money to influence legislation, which gives them a competitive advantage versus others. So that's the key thing. And this is reform of the anti-monopoly committee and the competition and many, many other areas where we're trying to tackle the uncompetitive environment or non-transparent environment, how the whole system functions. Politics of the reforms. That's, the majority of the reforms that are in the plan of the government are social reforms. So it's healthcare, it's a pension, it's a very sensitive reforms with the populists uprising across the world. It's a challenge because you need to sell things which could be beneficial in the long run, but actually has an impact short run. Still, and this is probably the best example is a land reform. I keep telling the story that the person who've been signing previous memorandums with IMF and others promising there will be land reform, now rallying against it, collecting vote, doing referendum against it. So it's, we see that a lot of controversial messages that that person is trying to do, but the land reform will be very decisive for the country because it's also part of the de-oligarchization for the country. Currently, there is a application for the Constitutional Court, which will enable actually 8 million people who own land to actually finally have access to sell it, to collateral, etc. Of course, the question is what kind of restriction will be put forward, but this is something that the government is currently working with the parliament on this one. Optics for the politics and the reforms, it's a challenge, and I mean, there is too many media in this. I'm already kind of understand that I'm on the mine zone, so I would be very careful doing any predictions, who, what, etc. At the same time, what the task for all political establishment in Ukraine is to build unity around healthcare reform, to build unity around education reform and social reforms, because these reforms could not be done over 1 year or 2 years. It's reforms that needs to last 10 years before they start generating effect. And that building coalition again between those who are in power and who are opposition is the priority now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Dirk?
Yeah, just to add a few things, it was none of the questions was directly asked to me, but if I allow two things simply. I think Anastasiya and Valerii had the right approach that on the question why are the reforms not seen by the average population. I think it is very much concentrated so far on the big cities, which you also said, and I think the task is to bring the reforms to the smaller cities and to the countryside. In order to make it really visible. I don't see this, if you see reports, also even on Ukrainian TV, you're mainly seeing reports from Kharkiv, from Odessa, from Lviv, or from the big cities, but not so much from the countryside. So very important. Participatory approach is also important, of course, to encourage people that they can change something. To say that, what you also said on the survey, that the majority of the Ukrainian people thinks that I'm not responsible to change corruption or to improve the fight against corruption. I think that's a sign. That's not only probably the reply that you would get on this question, but on many other questions when you ask them what needs to be done or who can do that. They always think others can do. That's still the Soviet approach, which needs to be changed in the minds of people, and even among young people you see this sometimes, which is surprising. Young people in the countryside. Civil society is extremely active. I think you hardly find a more vibrant place for civil society than Kiev. But go outside. You have in the big cities still a very vibrant society, in Dnipro, in Kharkiv, even in other places. But if you go to the countryside, it is much, much less the case. Environmental NGOs and NGOs who are dealing with food security, food safety, these kind of issues, are hardly present so far. They are maybe to be found in Kiev, but again, it's very difficult to find them in the countryside. Very important to encourage this. So that, I think, the inclusiveness again of the approach is very important, and I'm not only talking about the occupied areas, but also to the country, to work on the countryside. Communication, a very important point that was raised. Let me also mention our strategic communication task force that we have set up in the European External Action Service. Sometimes they are perceived as if they were only trying to fight Russian propaganda or other propaganda, which is not true. Actually, their main task is to support the communication, the positive communication on what has happened in Ukraine and in other Eastern Partnership countries and elsewhere. And they're working very closely, by the way, with your Ministry for Communication, with the Deputy Minister and with others. This has to be further improved to demonstrate to the people that there is a lot has happened already that maybe they don't see on an everyday basis. Visa, indeed, can only agree. I think this will be the first real sign that is where a result is visible for everyone, because everyone who will have the financial resources, one should add, because not everybody will have the financial resources to travel to the European Union, but those who have, for them it is really will be a first visible sign, and that's very important. One last thing, and that's not an EU or institution position, but what I would do if I were you, and I'm sure it's also not rocket science, if you want to win the hearts and minds of those people back who are in the occupied areas, is I would make a real jewel out of places like Kramatorsk or Slavyansk. I would make it such a difference that it should look so different from Lugansk or from other places in the occupied areas that people would love to come back and would love to live again under Ukrainian rule, under central rule. That would be my very personal take. I had the pleasure when I accompanied Commissioner Stylianides to Eastern Ukraine, and we went to among others, also to those. It's okay. It could, after having been also occupied for a while, both places, it's okay. But I would do much more out of these to create a real difference between the two sides.
Thank you, Dirk. This is greatly appreciated. I actually also visited Kramatorsk and Slavyansk recently, and I have to say that when it comes to the price of renting an apartment, Kramatorsk is already at the European level. Thanks for the experts. And I think if I would can suggest something, I would do Slavyansk, that shiny example, and nothing is happening in Slavyansk, I can guarantee you that, unfortunately. But just two things from my side before I opening again for questions. There is a recent municipal survey which was just published 2 weeks ago, which is showing that if indeed, when people are asked how things are going at the national level, they're very negative, skeptic. If you're saying how things are going in your city, they're much more optimistic. So, it is obviously the decentralization as well as this urban phenomenon, which is very visible, but certainly is showing that there is kind of hope. And also showing, and that's my second point, is what we have been saying, and I already told that, there's a lot of information warfare inside. The oligarchs' TVs, the Western interest, and sometimes I even have to say that our civil society friends and colleagues are contributing into this in a lot of ways, because actual direct experience with corruption is going down, but the perception is still very high, and most of the information about corruption is coming from the media, right? And my third point is, if you take a look a little bit at the de-oligarchization, which is hard to do and hard to say, it's not a complicated word, but all of the oligarchs are losing money. According to the freshest Forbes estimates, first, there is a very interesting phenomenon that there are 20 new millionaires in Ukraine in the top 100, all of them agriculture, right? So you can characterize that the gas oligarchs are out, the agriculture up, and the metallurgy industrials are down. But all of them lost significant amount of money. Just to say one data, Rinat Akhmetov used to be estimated for $23, $24 billion. It's now, the current estimate is 2.2 or 2.1, which means these are estimates, but these are 90% of the estimates. Obviously, the only question is how is President Poroshenko is doing on the list. He's still in the top 10, although according to the newest one, he is going down as well. It's because of the Russian in Russia. Anyway, is there any questions from the audience? There you go, too.
My name is Alina Belska. I have actually long experience in conflict management in South Caucasus. So when Ukraine happened, lots of my friends went to Ukraine, to Eastern Ukraine, and sort of now that I talk to them, the feeling that I get, or sort of the joke that they mention, is that Eastern Ukraine will go to the loser. So my question is sort of in what terms do you see the future of Eastern Ukraine?
Maybe I'll try to...
Just a minute, let me add another one thing.
Yes, hello, my name is Mikhaila Karcheva with the European Commission. My question is about privatization. It was mentioned a couple of times, but nothing too specific. It is a potentially dangerous process if it is not done correctly. So could you elaborate something about that? Is there something envisioned? Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? There you go.
Thank you. So my name is Marek Misak. I work for the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the EU. My question to the panelists would be, on the one hand, what would be the expectations from Ukraine and from the Ukrainians towards the EU in terms of support and action? And on the other hand, what the EU can realistically promise towards Ukraine, maybe in the short term, so in the view of the upcoming Eastern Partnership Summit, in the medium term, and in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to ask, actually, if it's possible, I think it would be important, the question, what the EU can deliver, not only what the EU can promise, but I will leave it as it. I would like to add, and that's specifically for Dirk, obviously.
Really?
I would like to also add, except Mr. Shymkiv who already answered that, what will be the prospects for reforms from your specific viewpoint, civil society, EU, and the government, as well as the priorities for the reforms, if you can add in a few sentences, what you would prioritize in the next year, or the 2017, let's put it like that. And then let's start with Mr. Shymkiv, the two previous questions, East Ukraine future, as well as the privatization. Thank you.
So on the, I just want to also mention, you mentioned agriculture. The last 3 years, Ukrainian results in agriculture have been fantastic. I mean, every single company that operates in agriculture has been receiving fantastic profits. And it's important to understand because despite the security situation, all companies, international and national, had a fantastic year financially, so which is also need to be taken into account. So question about, I'm not going to go into the details, but there are areas in Ukraine which have been growing, and this is high-tech industry, and this is agriculture industry. These two industries has actually good opportunity for growth, and they continue to grow. In the Eastern Ukraine, I think this is a very challenging question, and I think there is a lot of discussion internally taking place, and there is a conversation that I participate with within the community, in the cabinet of ministers, with the think tanks, etc. The question is complex because the time is ticking. Russia making everything possible to squeeze the time and to frozen the situation with a lot of disturbances, introducing all kind of crazy things like with local passports, seizing Ukrainian assets because it's employment for Ukrainian citizens, etc. We try to look into this also through the eyes of experts on Donbass. Surprise, surprise, that expert is Japanese who is living in UK. So we also try to look in there was a lot of research being done actually a long time ago about this region and some insights. The future of Eastern Ukraine is in Ukraine, like Crimea, full stop. The question is also with the 1.5 million internally displaced people. Some of these people get integrated into the communities and get a job and manage to start their businesses. Some not. Some people want to come back. So how this will be integrated, what's the future economically? What's going to happen with these enterprises which have been seized? How they will be, I mean, Russia is also cutting some of the enterprises in pieces and shipping it out. It's also a fact. So it's a much broader question which the whole situation has a lot of questions which we are currently discussing with the groups and teams. But for us, fixing the security situation is first priority. Because that means, I be sole believer that people can find solution through the conversation. Maybe difficult conversation, but the conversation. When bullets are shooting and people get killed, it's very difficult to have any meaningful kind of conversation, and because the nerves and the people killed and other things is very high. So fixing, and this is if I can ask anybody who can help us to influence the guy sitting in Kremlin to stop the war, stop supplying weapons, that would help big time to resolving the problem. Because the story that's been told in Gaig that now, this is a new story, that the terrorists are finding weapons in the mines of Donbass, including 450 tanks. You know, I don't know how you can stuff 450 tanks in the mine. Or, just to give you a number, the total shelling on Avdiivka was 9 wagons of ammunition. You know, how they appear there, it's a good example. It's a measurement that's been done. So the question is that when the Russians stop doing what they're doing, and when the reconciliation can happen, many countries went through this, we can do it. Stop shelling, stop supply weapons. We can find solution. And that looking into, and there is all the task force exists that's looking into how this will be. Privatization. From one side, it's a very important element, you know, to attract investment, etc. Ukrainian government sets the bar pretty high on the price. And I'm going to go through the very simple example. So one thing, we set the price pretty high. Expecting, because that's expectation from the society, that if we sell valuable asset, we need to sell high. The companies that come, they say, no, 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 take into account your security situation, credit, risks, etc. It's going to be here. So when all this discussion starts, in the commercial terms, even with the whole transparency and bringing international brokerage and etc. that was done before, we still have a expectation from the society that their assets would be on the price on which they will be sold, as well as politicians who would like to have the price high because they need to justify why certain assets being sold. It really doesn't contribute when suddenly on the date when the opposite supposed to be sold, suddenly the gas being cut off. And in the morning I'm meeting with one of the potential investor, and in the afternoon I have to somehow explain what really happened at the plant, which they were looking to bid, and suddenly it's been cut off the gas for the dead. So I think there is areas where internal forces trying to play, true. So there's a lot of things that happening, but creating a competitive conditions for and managing expectation both of citizens, but also politician and commercial entity who participate in tender would be the most difficult piece in the puzzle of the privatization. Maybe it's not a happy story that people wanted to broadcast, but I looked and I talked to the different people, both who want to buy and those who want to sell. And I think that the question of the privatization is a really complex one. But it's the only way how we can transfer assets for better management to those who can invest and contribute in the development of Ukrainian economy.
And what the EU can promise?
Security. Help us with, I mean, seriously, I know that I can put a big list, etc., and financial aid and do a comparison with Poland and others. I think the situation was visa-free was a good example where there was a cooperation and a clear list of actions and the results. But I think that I hope that Europe will not fall in the hands of the populists, because those people who help us, who support Ukraine, stand strong. I think that we've seen a lot of infiltration of Russian influence in the region, and I think that if Europe gets united and keeps united, that's the best story for us.
If I may, first of all, I have absolutely nothing to add to the issue of occupied territories. And indeed, reconciliation is Ukrainian and only Ukrainian business when Ukraine will gain control over its border and supply, and Russian forces will go out. Concerning our priorities, indeed, we have sometimes so much priorities, and you, sir, also mentioned a dozen of priorities, or even 2 dozens. I would like to concentrate. We could not reach a lot not focusing. And I will provide just very subjective view of a group of people from my NGO concerning priorities of the short run, next, let's say, 6 months, which are 4. First priority, and this is an absolute priority, is a judicial reform. Judicial reform, because people want justice, and they want justice now, and they could not get justice. And judicial reform, now there are 2 major things. One is important, and this is the selection of judges to Supreme Court, because this and only this could build trust, and this is being done with the extreme transparency now, but people would want even more transparency. We should keep this level and increase it. And another is a very important issue of anti-corruption court. What is being held now? We have many top corruptioners which are arrested, then released, because let's consider a case. A National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is an investigation agency, collect an evidence base and arrest a top official, and then go to the court, which is 100% corrupt. So there are 2 different strategies for NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and both are bad. First is to go to a normal judge, which is 100% corrupt, and which will, the case will be crumbled, and everything will be stopped. Another way is to go to the judge, having already a case against this judge. And indeed, this judge will stamp the decision which NABU will offer, but this is not about rule of law, and this is not about trust. So there is no good strategy with these anti-corruption cases. The only good strategy is to perform the demand of Ukrainian legislation, and to establish finally an anti-corruption court, which is anticipated by Ukrainian legislation, but not yet established, from the scratch, very openly, on the open contest basis, very transparently, and that will build trust to the whole chain. There is a chain of anti-corruption agencies with different functions, but without last chain anti-corruption court, it doesn't work. Simply doesn't work, and undermine trust to the whole chain. This is the priority number 1. So this is a judicial reform. The priority number 2 is public administration reform. This is simply about bringing many new people into offices to pay normal salaries, to concentrate on change management. Recently we had a big strategic session where 120 people worked for the whole day elaborating the strategy of public administration reform. 60 of them were top government officials, and another 60 were volunteers, including senior partners of Big Four, top international legal companies, and so on. And their strategy is here. It matches Sigma criteria and European Union visions. Just necessary to do it and to form a staff which will do this. I think this year will be we will break through in this reform. Without new people in offices, we could not maintain any reform normally. Next is state finances reform, which is a triangle: tax reform, pension reform, and budget reform. No one of these three could be done without any other two. And indeed, this is a social, but we finally should do this because without economic growth, we shall have big problems, both in defense and in social tension and so on. And number 4 is, last but not least, electoral reform. If you will consider 18 priorities declared by President when he came into his office, you will see that on 17 reforms there is certain progress, either very high, like in public procurement or police reform, or moderate, like in education reform, but 17 reforms with a progress and 1 reform with 0 progress, which is electoral reform. This is about to bring new people into politics. And concerning the expectations from EU, indeed, security is the matter, is the number 1, but going in details, what European Union could help in, we shall speak about why reforms are slow. Not only political will, as was said, but also sometimes a lack of institutional capacity, so a bad execution, and a lack of demands, which is a lack of understanding. In many cases, reforms are slow and resistance is high, not because of vested interests, but because of lack of understanding. And this is not about average citizen only, but also about elites. Take land reforms. Our research shows that big agricultural businesses simply are afraid to think about different scenarios in land reforms. And that is why just modeling and speaking will provide them with more chances. So European Union could support independent media, support civil society organizations not in the center but in the small towns, be diversified, and support implementation, not advisory.
Thank you. Long list. Nastya.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Valerii pointed out and Dmytro the what, and I just wanted to emphasize 2 points on the how, very briefly. One is advisory versus implementation capacity. I think we are very used over the last 25 years to receive a lot of advisory support, which was very much appreciated, but now the reforms that worked really well showed that it is when implementation capacity is provided and supported from the outside it works. We could see it was police, we could see it was Prozoro, we could even see it was the National Reform Council and EBRD support for it. So please reallocate the portion of funding that goes into implementation capacity as opposed to what is allocated for expert capacity. I understand it requires a totally different level of management and effort, administrative effort, etc., but it's really worth it. And second, when it comes to support for demand and support for civil society programs, I know it is much more difficult to run a program which is very decentralized and diversified. So please stop issuing large civil society development awards, but try to diversify it and reach out to more organizations that do different kinds of work as opposed to less organizations that are easier to manage administratively.
Yes. Future of Eastern Ukraine, I can only repeat, of course, inside Ukraine, same goes for Crimea. We, as EU, will, of course, continue to support fully the territorial integrity and sovereignty of your country, and I think we have done that in the past, and We have also said that the sanctions will only be lifted if following the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. Prospects for reforms, the areas, I mean, many areas have been mentioned. Obviously, judicial reform is number one. I would add the prosecution service to this, which needs to be absolutely reformed. The combination of both will reduce corruption already considerably. Then I would mention the decentralization one more time, because if you want to have the people in the regions more involved, you have to give them also more powers. So to conclude the public administration reform and to tackle the decentralization and to give more powers to the regions, to the rayons and to the cities, that is for me also key. Electoral reform indeed is, but it's a very tricky issue. We see in a number of neighboring countries attempts being made currently to reform the electoral reform in Moldova, in Georgia, in Armenia, and not all of them have true good intentions really to provide a more democratic views for the voters or positions. Privatization should be done indeed properly. I had experienced during my time in Ukraine myself the Odessa port side plant saga, and it's still not finished. So I hope that indeed you will not manage to have all the 3,500 privatizations, but the big ones, some major regional energy companies, to privatize those. And I forgot to mention the energy sector. If that would be very important to complete the reform of the energy sector, meaning to complete the reform of Naftogaz, and to do the electricity sector reform. That will make you save a lot of money because you will not need so much money combined with an increase of energy efficiency. Yep. So that is, I think, also very, very important. Then what can the EU realistically promise, or what can we do? First of all, obviously, we stand by your side with regard to security, with regard to your territorial integrity. I think that's very important that we stand by your side. And obviously, I can only but agree that we also hope that no populists will come to power in some of our member states, because we want to ensure this territorial integrity to the very end until you got your territories back. What else can we do? Obviously, we need, first of all, as I mentioned before, to fully implement the association agreement. So to complete finally this process, which we have completed already with the other two association agreement countries, Georgia and Moldova, I think it's very important. And of course, to make this agreement work. And that is the increase of the quotas for the autonomous trade measures for agricultural products, but perhaps also for other products, is of course the first step, which will be included, which will be increased hopefully, and of course to continue our financial support for the country, which you can be sure. And this, I'm sure, will also go once you have your territories back in eastern Ukraine. The EU, I'm sure, will participate also in the reconstruction of the Donbas. That is, these are what I see as the main priorities that we can offer at this moment in time, where, as you will all agree, an enlargement perspective state of play today is not excluded, but it's not on the agenda. Thank you very much.
Can I have one more wish for EU?
Since you're on the record, please.
When corruption takes place in many countries in the world, they actually go and buy property and stash their money in the actually well-respected countries. Many of these countries are members of the European Union. So the cooperation with law enforcement agencies is something very, very important. And particularly non-transparent acquiring of assets. I'll look at the initiative that's taking place in UK. It's also the recent arrests of some police people who try to lead information be corrupted in Germany for some Ukrainian oligarchs. So this is a good example when we need more of this. Because when some corrupt individuals travel for holidays and etc., they enjoy hospitality of European states. So I think that I understand the rule of law and the principles that exist in Europe, but the strengths and cooperation and information exchange between states and particularly Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. I know there is already cooperation with NABU, but I think that information exchange needs to be faster and better streamlined between law enforcement agencies.
Thank you so much. I also have two wishes for the end. I wish that Ukrainian oligarchs in 2017 put their money back to the country. It's number one, and more young, Western-educated Ukrainians will join the government. That's number two. This being said, I would like to thank the panel for being constructive, for the clarity, and for the concrete arguments. And thank you for coming, and we have a light reception following this. And I think the panel deserves an applause.